Welcome everyone to week 3 Korean food during colonial period from 1910 to 1945. My name is Chang Ju-song, a senior lecturer in Asian Studies and Korean Studies at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. The content that we will cover today is what changes have happened during the colonial period in terms of Korean food and food culture. So we will cover how the colonialists, the Japanese, brought new cultivation technology and industrial food processing, and also how Korean agriculture became a part of a global the food market as well. And we will also talk about the capitalistic agricultural practices brought by big Japanese companies and cooperatives to grow rice and other agricultural products in Korea and then export them to Japan and elsewhere. And also, what kind of new food and culinary culture were imported during this era, and also particularly the development of portable food. Until colonial period, Koreans, of course, food was delivered and brought from one place to another place, but this became more frequent during the colonial period because of the expansion of general education. So particularly for children, the school boys and girls, they started to bring lunchbox, which was very much influenced by Japanese lunchbox culture. And we will also talk about Ajinomoto, which has become an essential part of any Asian food culture today. And then in the end, we will talk about how Japanese colonial government policy on controlling alcohol production in Korea eventually made many traditional Korean alcoholic beverages to disappear. The goals of this part of the lecture is we hope that audience would have understood some of the new agricultural technology, including land reclamation and irrigation and chemical fertilizer use during this period, and also the introduction of the capitalistic agricultural practices this time, and also what impacts of these new capitalistic agricultural practices brought to Korea, and particularly Korean culinary life, and how Koreans were suffering from food deprivation, especially during the latter part of the colonial period from 1937 to 1945, when Japan entered a series of global war. And what kind of new food and cooking method and also commercial food industry were introduced in this period. So we hope that audience will understand these points through this lecture today, this time. Okay, first, what kind of new cultivation technology and industrialization and globalization of food production and consumption happened during the colonial period? First of all, because Japan was modernized much earlier than Korea or China in pre-modern history already, at least from the 17th century. So Japan had much more developed agricultural practices and technologies. And during the colonial period, naturally, these new technologies were introduced to Korea, particularly because Japanese wanted to increase rice production in Korea to supply the Japanese society, including the industrial workers, but also the soldiers. And not only agriculture, but also fisheries and particularly seaweed cultivation, for which Japan had much more advanced technologies. they were also brought to Korea, and Korean fisheries and seaweed cultivation started to develop in this period. And also, up to this point, even though Koreans were consuming doenjang and 간장 and so on, but these products became massively produced industrial and commercial products in this period. And more importantly, as Japan colonized Taiwan earlier than Korea, and then Manchuria later in 1932, so all Japanese archipelago and Japan's colonies of Taiwan, Korea, and Manchuria, they became connected as a market and also agricultural and industrial domain. So there became a lot of exchanges among these countries, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Manchuria, and of course that impacted and brought a lot of changes to Korean culinary life and agricultural practices as well. Okay, the first session in this lecture is rice production increase policy by Japanese government, and also diversification of agricultural products in the colony of Korea. Japan traditionally, often because it was an archipelago, it was a big island country, when they fail in producing enough rice, Japanese will suffer. And particularly because now Japan became a more industrial country, particularly in early 20th century, especially 1920s, a lot of industrial sectors brought people into industry, and the number of farmers were reduced, and Japan required way more rice than before. And ever since Korea was colonized, formally from 1910, the Japanese government tried to introduce new technologies to Korean farming sector to increase the production of rice. This required modern cultivation technology, but including massive scale irrigation and chemical fertilizers and so on. And another policy that the Japan pursued in Korea through the government general in Korea was to diversify Korean agriculture for economic development. So these were pursued by Japanese government, and in this process, many Japanese large agricultural companies and cooperatives entered into the Korean agricultural market, and they became the dominant players in rice production, milling, and trading. The Japanese rice market, however, has been fluctuating. Sometimes in good year, Japanese farmers produce much more rice than other years. So in those years, rice price in Japan goes down. Then also when Japanese farmers failed in producing enough rice in Japan, then rice price will go up. So this has a huge economic impact on the Korean agricultural sector, of course. Okay, so how Japan increased rice production in Korea? Many things: new technology, new variety of rice, which Japanese scientists developed, and also some simple method that traditionally Japanese were applying to rice cultivation. For example, as you see on the photo, the image right side, the Koreans are transplanting rice. And up to this point, it seems like the Koreans didn't use strings to plant their rice in exactly in rows. But in Japan, this practice was already in Japan, and so from that time on, the Koreans started to plant rice in accurate rows. And now this helped farmers to move in the rice paddies and also to remove the weeds from the field. So this was one of the many new methods that were developed in Korean farming. And as I said, it was not just the farming, but it was also the fisheries and seaweed cultivation, which Japan had advanced technology and practices. And first of all, the colonial government in Korea made a new law in controlling a fisheries industry, because until then, Koreans really didn't have much law and controlling of fishery and seaweed cultivation. But now you had to have government permission to catch fish and also grow seaweed. So now this, through these practices, Korean fisheries and seaweed cultivation was well controlled by the colonial government. Japanese cooperatives and fisheries companies, they introduced new cultivation technologies, and they started to grow the traditional seaweed that Koreans were also growing, but in a massive and more industrial way. So for example, kim, or Japanese called nori, became more abundantly produced in this time, and also very important seaweed with aga, which is widely used in food industry and also in biological labs, which is the Japanese call kanten, and also kelp, where Koreans call it miyeok and Japanese call it wakame, and also Korean dashima, which Japanese call kombu, and all these seaweeds are very important source of food industry and other industrial use, and they started to be produced in a massive and industrial way. Since that time, this fishery and seaweed production in Korea started to grow rapidly since, especially after 1920s. And of course, this brought naturally some culinary exchanges between Koreans and Japanese. But it was not just one-sided. Koreans always learn new things from Japan. Yes, mostly true. But also Japanese also learned many things from Korean, the fisheries industry and Korean fishermen. And one of them is 명란젓. The Koreans traditionally, 명란젓 was very much consumed in east coast of Korea. When Japan opened Wonsan, the east coast of the Korean peninsula, after the Ganghwa Treaty in 1876, now some Japanese learned this and brought to Japan, and today Japan is famous for mentaiko. And mentaiko is widely used in onigiri and other, and there's even mentaiko donburi as well. So anyway, food exchanges happen. And also Koreans learned some new things that they didn't know before. And now that include so-called 멸치 다시 in Korean. And now that's traditionally Japanese were already using iriko dashi. And so this was a relatively new practice in Korean food during this period. So as you see here on the left, the big Japanese fisheries companies came to Korean waters and they caught a lot of whales, and the number of whales rapidly declined around Korea, and also particularly seals, wild seals in Ulung Island, around Tokto, or Japanese called Takeshima, and they were virtually extinct through the colonial period. And on the right, the image is Japanese mentaiko rice, and now this Japanese know that this mentaiko was from Korea. The food processing industry also came to Korea, and for example, they also brought large-scale processing facilities, especially in southern islands in Korea, for making canned fish and also alcohol, spirit from sweet potatoes, and also seaweed processing factories. And also, Japanese started to produce Japanese miso, shoyu, sugar. Now, sugar started to become popular, massively produced in Japan ever since Japan occupied Taiwan. Because in Taiwan, they cultivated sugarcane, and with that sugar brought to Korea, and the Japanese established some sugar factories in Korea which produced sugar. So from this time, sugar was widely available in Korea. And also, as Japan was trading with the Americans and Australians, they were able to import wheat flour from these countries. So the many food processing companies that use wheat flour prospered. And some canned food, especially canned beef and canned meat factories were established in Korea, especially during the war, to feed Japanese soldiers in forefront. And as I said, when Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Manchuria was connected as a one market, that Manchurian grains such as soybean, particularly corn and millet, they were imported to Korea, and Korean rice and other things were exported more to Japan, but particularly imported product from Manchuria was soybean. Manchuria was an excellent place to grow soybean. And actually, soybean originated in Northeast Asia, including Manchuria. So a lot of soybean was available, more doenjang were produced, and ganjang, as well as dubu, or Japanese called tofu, were massively produced, and that fed people, Chinese in Manchuria, but also Koreans and Japanese. And as I mentioned, sugar from Taiwan was cheaply available. And it was that time that Koreans started to use more sugar. This is the end of the session 1. And in session 2, we will talk about more specifically how capitalistic agricultural practices impacted on Korean life during colonial period.